Hello and welcome to yet another video, and in this video I would like to talk about this camera right here. It's the Canon Eos 1Ds Mark III. Now this camera has been out for quite a while now, I know, but I personally still really enjoy using this camera, and also I think that this camera still delivers really great looking results. So in this video I'll be giving you my thoughts and opinion on this camera based on the image quality and also the operational side of things. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into the video. So the Canon Eos 1Ds Mark III. Now this camera has been out for quite a while now, I know. I think way back in 2007. So yeah, this camera still delivers really great results in my opinion. And in this video, I'll be breaking it down to 3 different sections. The first sections, I'll be talking about the ergonomics, the operational side of things, how this camera operates, and then I'll be talking about the image quality, and then I'll be just leading into my conclusion. So let's first start with the ergonomic side of things and the operational side of things of this camera. The ergonomics of this camera is, well, it's built like a tank pretty much. It is quite a nice and rugged camera. It is fully weather sealed. It is however meant for studio, as Canon has the S over here. Many people believe it's for studio, and it only shoots at 5 frames per second, whereas the 1D Mark III really shoots at 10 frames per second. And I believe, yeah, this is the 1D Mark III. It is actually a little bit lighter and a little bit smaller than the 1DS Mark III, though the button layouts are pretty much identical for the most parts. This camera, it is bigger than the 1D Mark III or the 1D line in general, but it is still slightly smaller than the 1DX line of cameras, which is also full frame but comes much later than this. So if you're using it as like a size reference, it is between the 1D line and the 1DX line, this camera. So yeah, but anyway, I personally love the button layout and everything. I think it's quite nicely arranged. Being a very simple camera, well, at the time it wasn't really a simple camera, but you know, nowadays we have mirrorless cameras with a lot of features and a lot more buttons that needs customizing. But being just a photocentric camera, I think that all the buttons up here and also here are nicely logically placed, and having a vertical grip here is also quite nice, though I wish that there would also be a joystick somewhere here, but you know, you can't really get everything. But yeah, it's just a really nicely laid out button-wise camera. But also in terms of menu settings, everything is also very nicely and efficiently arranged, being Canon of course. And it's just, being a camera that doesn't have a lot of features also means that the menu doesn't really need a lot of time to really go through. So with an already really efficiently organized menu, you know, you can just get to your quick settings really quickly. And also this camera was the first full-frame camera from Canon, I believe, that offered live view, and even though it's rather quite limited and slow in terms of activation, like yeah, it takes quite some time to activate, it is actually quite useful. And while we're in live view, the screen on here is actually quite nice to use. It is reflective, however, and if you're shooting in like midday light, you might need to actually shade it a little bit. But to be honest, in terms of giving you great composition, it actually will give you quite a nice representative of the what you're actually seeing through the lens. My next point on here is actually the weather sealing. The weather sealing on here is actually quite nice. I've taken it to beaches, I've taken it through heat waves, and to be honest, it is still surviving. And you know, this camera actually has more than 1 million shutter life on here, hence why I actually got it for quite cheap. So it's still going very strong, and it's just a testament to how strong this camera is built. And onto the next point, which is the battery life. The battery life on here is actually quite strong. This is a third-party battery, but it actually shares the same battery as some of the other 1D series cameras, like the 1D Mark IV and the 1D Mark III, and I still have the genuine battery for this camera. And to be honest, I haven't changed the battery on this camera for the past week, simply because, well, it's really only my street photography camera, the camera I take to beach, the camera that I do some sort of like basic landscape or cityscape pictures with. It's not really my intensive photography professionally used camera, but even if I were to use it professionally, I think that the battery life would still last for quite some time. So yeah, it's such a great camera with really long battery life. And of course, what I really love about this camera is the light. It's actually blue. Like many of the 1D series cameras, I really love the blue light on the LCD screen. Unlike the more modern 1DX or even like the lower line of cameras from Canon, the 5D, the 5D Mark II, the 7D, and so on and so forth, they all have orange, and I find that quite plain and not so nice looking. But on this camera it's blue, and it's just, yeah, it's pretty nice. And this camera cannot actually record video, but you can still record audio if you want to, like, you know, have a sound reference to a photo file. Then you can just, you know, record an audio there. Let's say if you're shooting a portrait session with, you know, someone very important, or a story portrait session, then you can always record audio on here, and it's actually going to save as an audio file that you can actually have a reference to, because the file of the audio will be the same file naming as your photo file. So yeah, I think that it's actually a really nice and unique feature to have. Of course, for cameras nowadays, a lot of cameras actually have these features, but for back then it's quite rare, and only professional cameras actually has this feature. But I still think it's quite useful and good to actually have, even in such a price range of a camera. And my next point is actually the viewfinder. The viewfinder is actually quite nice and big. It's actually also quite bright and quite accurate. And to be honest, the autofocusing system in here is also quite great. You can see all of the autofocusing points quite nicely expanded in here, though it's not as customizable as the more modern cameras or even the more modern DSLRs, but it's still quite a nice autofocusing points to really look through. And to be honest, it's quite accurate as well, unless if you're using something like the 1.2 lenses. That's when the autofocusing points can be not so reliable. So I took it to beaches, and I took it to shoot different portrait sessions as well, but of course nothing professional. But I also noticed that the autofocusing points can hunt a little, but also when it confirms that it's in focus, it can be slightly out of focus at f1.2. So if you're using f1.2 lenses, you might have to consider, you know, refocusing or shooting different shots, shooting from different angles to make sure that at least one of your shots are in focus, or just use manual focus override. But then again, at f1.2, it can be hard to judge through this little viewfinder here. But that's what you have this live view screen for, actually. But of course, if you're shooting with live view, do take into consideration that it will take longer time just to have that 100% focus, you know, with the f1.2. So yeah, that's just like minor nitpicking. But of course, if you're shooting at, you know, f2, f1.8, f2.8, they'll all be easily in focus and quite nice and accurate as well. So yeah, that's it for the usability and the ergonomic side of things. The grip is really nicely deep, and it's also really beefy. Of course, it's not really as comfortable as the 1DX because it's quite a small indent here, whereas the 1DX, the 7D, the 5D Mark III, they all have a much bigger indent here so that you can grip it more comfortably, but it's still quite nice and comfortable and built like a tank. It is still a reliable camera. It shoots at 5 frames per second, which in my opinion, it is still a very comfortable frame rate to shoot at, especially when you're just focusing on studio stuff, on general portraits, on landscape, things like that. So yeah. Oh, and the shutter sound on here is also quite nice, I find. Let me focus on something. And yeah. Yeah, I really love the shutter sound on here. The shutter slap, it's actually quite nice. And of course, it will kind of generate certain or attract certain crowd or certain people to look at you when you're out actually taking pictures, because it is still quite loud. But you know, you just kind of get used to it and just live with it. You either hate it or actually like it, and I quite like the shutter sound of this camera. But anyway, moving on to the image quality. The image quality of this camera is actually quite nice. I love the dynamic range, I love the color rendition, I love the color reproduction of this camera. It's just a really nice camera to use. The skin tones on this camera is also quite nice. The camera deals really nicely with complex skin tones as well. Though I haven't used it for professional use, but I can say that even just taking it with me on holidays or just doing some simple like street snaps here and there, it's a very nice camera to use, and the color out of this camera is just still really nice. Of course, it will not have the greatest dynamic range, nowhere near as good as, you know, the more modern cameras, but I think because of the natural rendition into the highlights and shadows, it's still a very nice camera to use, and it will still look quite nice whether the dynamic range is good enough for you or not. That being said, if you're shooting a lot of raw images, then the raw images is definitely good enough to retrieve a lot of details, and of course, as long as you are aware of its limitations with high ISO, like I wouldn't go higher than 1600 or 1250, then it's completely fine. So yeah, just be careful with the certain lighting scenarios that you're shooting, and also the certain ISO settings that you're also using, that, you know, you're not using too much ISO and then, you know, later really recover a lot of shadows. Then it's an easy way to really have a lot of noise or introduce a lot of noise into the image. But of course, with the 21 megapixel sensor, you can actually trade some of the image resolution in with, you know, using higher ISO and then denoising it later, because if you're ending up with posting the images on social media like Instagram, Facebook, what have you, then you can really just kind of, you know, use the denoise feature, trade in some of the resolution, some of its sharpness with the high ISO denoising. So yeah, just keep in mind, you kind of have that headroom if you want to, but I understand if you don't want to use that headroom as well. Or with the 21 megapixel, if you want to crop in, you still can crop in quite a bit as well. So yeah, this camera, even though it's such an old camera, you still have quite a bit of headroom to really work with, and yeah, be a bit more flexible with your files. So yeah, not really a lot to talk about in terms of image quality. It's still quite nice. Of course, it has some moire and aliasing here and there if you shoot a lot of fine patterns, but this camera will deal really nicely in a lot of the general photography purposes. So yeah, now into the conclusion. This camera is still a great camera, especially for the price point of around 500 to 700 euros. I got mine for under 500 euros, around 490 euros, because of that 1 million shutter actuation, which again proves to be like a testament to how tough this camera is. And through all this time, you know, still going strong and still deliver really great results, this camera really proved to be such a versatile camera and a tough, reliable camera to use. This camera accepts CF cards and SD cards, so you can also shoot like as a backup or just an overflow kind of camera, or just use one media card. I only use CF card because I really only like using CF cards versus SD cards, but that's just me. Yeah, otherwise you can't really go wrong with this camera. You just invest like around 700 euros or 500 euros or anything in between, and you are already getting such a nice and rugged camera, really. I know I talk like I'm just advertising this camera, but it's really true that this camera is a rugged camera for such a price point. And I think that if you're starting out photography for your business, and if you're looking at such a reliable and, you know, rugged camera to go into do like wildlife photography or like professional studio photography or professional portrait photography, but like in a really harsh environment, then, you know, this camera is a camera to really look at. Also, with that live view feature and also that weather sealing feature, it is a feature that within this price point also quite hard to overlook. And not to mention that battery life, that's also quite good. But yeah, that's just pretty much my opinion. I hope you can actually gain something from this video. If you need a free photography guidebook, it's linked down in the description section below. Just click and download this absolutely for free on my website. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching. Stay safe, have fun shooting. Till next time, bye for now.